Mike Thomas, thank you for joining me for another installment of Evolutionary Conversations.
My pleasure.
And today we're gonna spend some time talking about the state of play and trauma, healing, safety, resilience, self-expression. So, I asked Mike to join me on this mostly because I thought we would have some complementary and perhaps even um, respectful disagreements about some of these. But I suspect there's a lot more agreement than there is disagreement. So, and I like to bring new perspectives. So thanks, Mike.
You're quite welcome. I'm looking forward to
So let's start off with the simple stuff.
it.
Neurological safety, neuroperception, co-regulate, and polyvagal theory. Would you like to lead us off with that, please, sir?
Sure. Well, the essence of being trauma informed is understanding the different states that our autonomic nervous system puts us into automatically, hence the term autonomic,
Yeah.
and what physical, emotional, mental, and potentially spiritual experiences. How do we measure that anyway? That's why I say potentially. Um, how do those things get experienced in the human game of life when you're in a different state? Does someone who is, completely triggered and maybe they're just being a complete dick, you know, they're in survival mode, most likely. It's not about justifying the behavior per se, but if we understand from a trauma informed lens, like zooming out and going, okay, there's the behavior, this is what we see.
Yeah.
And then there's what's going on underneath in the nervous system. And so polyvagal theory stands for, or if you break down the word, poly, many, vagal, the vagus nerve. And there are three basic branches. And there's an amazing way of looking at this like a traffic light that simplifies the whole experience of the nervous system. If you look at this wonderful chart, thank you. At the top of the chart is the highest level of stress that we can experience in the autonomic nervous system. And you might consider that like a red light at a stoplight. Stop, immobilize, don't move. There's a specific branch of the parasympathetic nervous system called the dorsal vagal branch that gets activated there, and it stops us from functioning. Down a little bit lower is the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, and that's where we're in anxiety, fight or flight. And right now I'm describing the negative versions because there are positive versions of all of these. And then
Oh,
as we get to the lowest level of stress, there's the green light response, you might call it, with the ventral vagal parasympathetic nervous system activated. And when we're down at the lowest level, we function at our best. It's what's referred to as neurological safety. And so the sort of obvious definition of safety that we might all think of, like, okay, there's no lion in here and I'm not fighting for my life. There's nobody holding a
right,
gun to my head, right?
right.
That's the obvious version of safety. But then you get a little bit deeper into what's going on a nervous system level, and you can look at, okay, am I relaxed? Am I holding tension in my shoulders? What's my breathing doing? These are all signs that we are either in neurological safety or we're elevated. That is, our arousal level is up. A lot of people associate that arousal word with sexual arousal. That's just one type of arousal. And so as we move up that chart, we experience more and more survival state based
Sure.
nervous system responses, right? So the gist of polyvagal theory is looking at, okay, so what's going on underneath behavior, and can we place ourselves on that chart to get a clear sense of what's going on inside underneath
Yeah.
this behavior? And this is a great tool for compassion, for one. And also, what can I do to bring myself back into a more regulated state?
Sure. Sure. Which is why self-regulation is so important. But so, and to get back to the compassion piece, and I want to get to the positive aspects of these as well. So the compassion piece, we could easily just be empathetic and be like, oh, they're in yellow right now, so I'm not going to react to their reaction. I'm going to like hold space for that, step in for that. Is that what you mean by that?
Absolutely, I do. And
All right, cool.
it's definitely worth noting that
Yeah.
if you're not observing what's going on in your own chart, you're going to have zero capacity to
I,
accurately assess the other person.
I mean, the whole thing does sort of presuppose a level of self-awareness that, I
Sure.
mean, I mean, and actually, I should probably start off every one of these conversations I have with that. Like, by the way, there's going to be a presupposition of some self-awareness here. All right. So, can you say a little bit? I mean, this isn't on our outline, but would you be willing to say a little bit about the positive aspects of each of these? Uh,
Sure.
especially,
So
especially perhaps the yellow one, because I think there's a rumor
yes.
out there.
So the easiest way to illustrate both the positive and negative versions of this is
Sure.
to look at an example of how it plays out. So
Mhm.
if I am in complete neurological safety, let's say I'm having a conversation with a friend, or I'm doing one of my favorite things when I'm skateboarding. Am generally at a low level until I my breath level starts coming up.
Sure.
In a situation where I'm going into a positive version of the yellow state, I'm mobilizing my system and I'm playful. It's what Stephen Porges, the creator of polyvagal theory, calls neurological play as a state. And it's very healing to be in that place because it's actually a combination of the green and the yellow at the same time. Now, if somebody all of a sudden runs into the skate park with a baseball bat, I'm going to go into the yellow zone in a negative way, in terms of discomfort, in terms of survival. I need to get out of there. Okay, I'm using my skateboard to get out of there as fast as I possibly can. I am mobilized and I'm moving out of danger, right? That's the purpose, is evolutionary purpose of each of these branches, right?
Fight or
If,
flight
yeah,
mobilization, right? Sure.
yeah, fight flight response is what it's generally known as, and I use the term mobilization because that bigger category of it
Yeah.
helps us to recognize a lot more states. Anxiety is a mobilized state
Sure.
when
Yeah.
our minds and our bodies are agitated and we're hyper vigilant looking for threats. That's
There's
movement
a
oriented. We feel a lot, and it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, in the when I've worked with clearing anxiety out of clients' nervous systems, one of the challenges I've encountered is a lot of them use it as a motivation strategy. And so we have to implement a new motivation strategy, a vision-based motivation strategy, which is um, you know, learn. But I thought that was it's like, oh, because I don't relate to that. I mean,
Mm.
partly because of my own lived experience. There's not a whole lot that makes me anxious. Well, it's nothing actually, even when it should, which is another problem.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I can relate.
please continue. So other positive aspects.
So we'll get more into this later when we talk about healing methods,
Sure.
because when we get into the red zone, um, getting back out of it is not about calming down in an obvious way. You actually need to use that yellow state in the middle to mobilize, to bring ourselves all the way back down to green. You can't just jump to green. In fact, part of what being trauma informed is recognizing that you can't go from that red state of immobilization right to the green state. There's a transition that happens, and there's a skill set involved, an awareness within yourself, and of course the practitioner that's supporting you.
I'd like to
Um,
under I'd,
yeah,
I'd like to underline that point. For me, all interior skills or navigating your interiors, they're physical skills. It's kind of one of my primary principles in my own work is navigating your interiors is a physical skill. Communication skills are a physical skill. And all the things that come along with that. Like there's different levels of competency. There's, sometimes new ways of interacting with yourself or with others is awkward at first. It's like when you first try to bench press if you've never or do like if you've never done it before, you're like, oh, this is or skateboarding or pickleball, whatever it happens to be. Um, at first it's awkward and you might skin a knee and you're gonna feel uncomfortable. And then you reach a certain level of comfort with it, and then you also gain a bunch of muscle memory. So navigating your own interiors is really the same way. It's a physical skill. And the reason for that principle is it gives people grace around like, oh, I'm learning a new skill. Like it's not, and I think one of the, oh God, what would I call it? The biggest pieces of, there's a technical term for it. Bullshit is that you will go to a weekend workshop and then suddenly have, all these new skills. It's like, well, you'll transform what might be possible for you in a weekend workshop. You don't actually gain competency. I don't think, but anyway, please continue.
And so what you just mentioned about building those physical skills is another part about being trauma informed, by the way, is recognizing that it is a physical base of experience in our nervous system. And that
Yeah,
when we address the physical level, the other layers above that, and this is where that chart I mentioned before to you
sure.
before we started on layers of memory is so important. The
And
base level of,
and
we'll get to that later.
we'll put these images in the comments for people so they'll have references.
Cool. And okay, let me continue with the example. So if I'm in the skate park and I get cornered by this guy with a baseball bat, uh, it's possible that I could fight back. But what if the guy is like 6'7" and there's no way I can run away. There's no way I can fight back. What does the body do automatically? It goes into the red zone, immobilization, shutdown. I might faint. I might freeze. These are all immobilized responses. I will probably get dry mouth. I'll probably uh, slow down my heart rate. That's not because I'm calm. It's because my body's going into a freeze state, collapse, immobilization of some sort
Sure.
that basically preserves resources until I can get out of there.
Yeah.
And when you look at a prey animal on, the Serengeti, a cheetah and a gazelle, let's say, if you slow down that video of the gazelle catching the neck, you'll see that right before the cheetah catches the neck of the gazelle actually collapses beforehand. Why would it do that? Because it knows it can't knows, I'm saying on a body level, it
Mm,
automatically responds by collapsing so that it doesn't struggle, because otherwise the neck would get broken and then it's over, right?
sure.
And so it's adaptive to shut down. When somebody pulls a gun on you, you're going to freeze. That's a good thing. Don't try and take that gun. You're going to get shot.
You might freeze.
Right. Well, it depends on your training. You can
Yeah.
actually overcome some of these responses in a healthy, higher level of resilience way. Military training, martial arts, in
Yeah,
certain circumstances.
there's lots we'll cover tonight, and that's one of the major things I want to get to is how do we increase capacity, and also the fact that there is choice around changing these zones.
Mm,
I mean, I personally have been in red twice in my life that I can recall. Once was I went off a bicycle ramp and just blacked out.
mm,
And have a lovely scar on my, I woke up like sliding along the pavement because I just blacked out. Which is also one of the reasons I'm like, maybe I shouldn't skydive. Like I don't,
yep. Yeah.
because if I black out on a bicycle jump at 14 years old or whatever, like, maybe I just prefer to have my feet on the ground. And the other time was a year ago. I got a biopsy in my thigh. Like they were testing skeletal muscle tissue. And I passed out and they're like, does that happen to you a lot? Does your, vagal nerve get, and I was like, only one time when I was 14. But I started training as a martial artist when I was 4. I went to prison when I was 19. So like the things I've navigated in my life I feel have increased my capacity. And I did a lot of trauma healing as well. But the point I
Mm,
wanted to really underline, and by the way, I did a lot of, like, I was afraid to talk from the ages of 15 to 19, like
mm.
really. But that's a whole, other thing. But I just want people to understand that these aren't hardwired. They might be hardwired at first, but you can develop choice and you can increase your capacity. So I just want to make sure we reinforce that.
Yes. Well, that brings up neuroception actually as a really
Awesome.
important point in polyvagal theory and being trauma informed. Is that neuroception basically means the perception of your nervous system on an unconscious level of
Hmm.
your environment.
Hmm.
So when it perceives whatever it perceives, it changes your mode. It's a bottom up experience. Your body experiences, okay, a certain level of safety or lack thereof,
Sure.
and your body will shift as a result of that. That's not something you consciously control. It happens
Right.
automatically
100%.
to you, I guess you could say, but you have
Or
then the opportunity
within you. I don't know.
with it. Well, so we affect one another, and this brings up the maybe our friendly disagreements here on self-regulation, co-regulation concept
Let,
potentially.
let's pause on that one and let's because I actually want to get to self-esteem next, but so let's definitely do that one, but let's not do it right now. Please continue on the with your let's finish the neuroception thing.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
So your nervous system perceives what's going on in your environment
sure.
and it adjusts your mode accordingly. So
Yeah,
if you're in green, it's because your body perceives you need to be in green. If you're in
sure.
yellow, it perceives you need to be there.
Yeah,
If you're in red, it perceives you need to be there in order to survive.
yeah,
And you can become aware of when you're in various states. And there are wonderful tools that you can use to support lowering that stress load appropriately
yeah,
so that you can develop resilience, so that you can get out of that uh, dangerous situation in a way where you don't get stuck there. Getting
sure.
stuck there is what trauma is. It's not the event that happened, it's the nervous system repeating a survival response that it thinks it needs to, even though it's over. The danger's over, but the body thinks it needs to protect itself. And that's another part of being trauma informed.
Yeah. And sometimes that's just like somebody replaying it over in their mind over and over again, which, you could also change that. I mean, one of the first NLP processes they got famous for was PTSD and the trauma process, which takes about 15 minutes and basically it's replaying it in your mind, but knowing that you're safe after and then running it backwards. And like, and I don't use that process since, for the last, well, not for 25 years, but I use other things. But if you're playing the movie over and over in your mind, everything is hypnosis, and you're basically re-traumatizing yourself every time you reimagine it. And if you have enough self-awareness to be like, hey, I could imagine a different thing, or I could imagine, that event differently, because memory's tricky. We don't respond to reality. We respond to our internal representations of reality. Super basic thing, which by the way is why I don't eyewitnesses are horrible on a witness stand. But it's just untrustworthy. Um, but I would love to talk about the necessary, like the critical role that self-esteem plays. And I want to define self-esteem first. And I
Mhm.
think it helps expand that green zone. And so, and I want to tell you a story about the post experience I had in the post office. So first of all, the definition of self-esteem I prefer is there's two components: knowledge of your efficacy, or knowing that you're competent to deal with whatever life throws at you.
Mhm.
And that's to varying degrees, and it's in certain contexts, etc. And that's feedback based, like results based, not. Then there's another component which is about self-worth, about self-acceptance, about boundaries. That's a second parallel component, but they're not like they work together, but they could be completely different tracks. Which is why I created a 4 quadrant system for self-esteem. I'll
Mhm.
talk about some other time. Because you could like if you're like look if you're people pleasing, you might be externally validated, but also externally referenced. So you're looking for feedback, but also like your worth is tied up in what other people how they perceive you, and it could be just whether they laughed at a joke or not, or whether they and you're. But also you could be on the flip side of the spectrum, and there's 4 quadrants, but the other one of the other quadrants is you're internally validated and internally referenced, and then you're just an asshole or a sociopath or a, like, or you're just like, why do I keep offending everybody? I don't know. Anyway, um, but if we know that we can navigate reality, navigate life, and our self-acceptance and so forth, that's a settled matter. Like we're all children of God or a whole, holograms of the universe or whichever metaphor you choose. Like your self-worth is a settled matter, your divinity, but your efficacy. So I like to like value and worth. I like to distinguish out into those two.
Mhm.
If you know you can handle a situation, and this is why like people get triggered around like an uncomfortable conversation, they're not sure that they have the competency to navigate a difficult conversation, or they're not sure like, or their value is or their self-worth or their whatever is tied up in how someone else reacts. Maybe they're in a codependent relationship, but let's
Mhm.
assume healthy self-esteem. And let's assume that that's also increasing over time. Like it's not, do I have high self-esteem or low? It's analog. It's not binary. It's not a, you know,
Mhm.
it's dial and a switch. Um, the more situations you successfully navigate, the bigger your green zone will get, I think, on that scale. It's like, well, I handled that situation. I should be able to handle this situation. And so the green zone gets larger. This is my take. And having known virtually nothing about polyvagal theory until you mentioned it to me a few days ago. But I looked at it and I was like, well, the object should be to increase that green zone, right? And I think you had some, you're like, and I was like, no, but you know, you're like,
From a certain perspective, that's accurate for sure.
I mean, you know,
There's nuance,
yeah, of course, of course. And I mean, there's probably a whole book on that. Like we could, you know, there's probably like, or at least a chapter, right? And I remember I was in a life partnership with somebody who was trained in a certain organization around relationship, which neither one I will name for just for it's not helpful. But part of it was, well, that's outside of my zone or outside of my range. And I'd be like, well, range is something that's meant to be, well, you know, like, thank you for letting me know. And also, range is something that expands. I mean, it's a capacity. Capacities expand or they contract if they're atrophied, which is another thing I want to talk about, which is I think over the pandemic, a lot of these things became atrophied, our ability to relate and connect and navigate
Mhm.
certain things, which led to an article I recently saw that was like, introverts are taking over the economy. And I was like, introverts, or we've just contracted our skills over the pandemic. Anyway, I just want to I wanted to inject the self-esteem component and then,
Mhm.
yeah, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. I see this as a perfect tangent into the concept of co-regulation and how early development is dependent upon co-regulation. That is a learned body language experience. This is nonverbal from the
Yeah.
parents to the infant.
Yeah.
And from that blueprint of experience, we learn self-regulation within. And to whatever degree co-regulation is off in some way, shape, or form, that it's not sufficient to teach us healthy self-regulation,
Yeah.
that is the experience we'll bring to the world, our perception, our behavior, our capacity. And this
Yeah.
brings up attachment styles. It's a great way to categorize these
Sure.
things.
Yeah.
And you know, you can probably categorize these things a million different ways, but there's a lot of science behind the regulation of the nervous system within attachment styles. And so you get, you know, we were having a conversation earlier about the 4 types of regulation that we can break this down into, and how
Yes.
co-regulation and self-regulation, in both in healthy ways, are essential for the health of the human being. As Dr. Bruce Perry says in his work around child development and healing trauma, the fundamental unit of the human being is not the individual, it's the group. And we can become more self aware, we can become, you know, more competent, and that is reinforced and built and supported through co-regulation, through the experience of relationships. There's the relationship with ourselves, and we reinforce that, and that's, I think, part
Sure.
of what your work in self-regulation is with NLP. But
Well, NLP is 20% of my work, just to be responsible. Like,
ah, got it.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I have more to learn about you.
In fact, I reject when people are like he's an NLP guy. I mean, I lead NLP trainings, but when they're like he's an NLP guy, I'm like 20% of what I do.
Got it.
Just to be clear. Yeah.
I did not know that. You learn something new every
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah. Well, it's, you know, it's one It's one modality. Anyway,
Mhm.
please continue.
So if you look back at that chart, or if you imagine it in your mind, the lowest level of stress
Mm.
is where secure attachment functioning happens, and this comes from development and co-regulation with a caregiver who is able to sufficiently meet attachment needs. Now, what are attachment needs? Essentially, the infant can't regulate their own nervous system, and so they need to learn it, and they need support in that process, without which they would die, literally die. It's a physical need as well as an emotional need. And the study of the children in Romania who were left in the in the orphanage with far too many to pick up. The ones that weren't picked up, they did die, and they couldn't explain it at the time. But it was because they didn't have
Right,
co-regulation, so their nervous
right.
systems didn't learn
You're talking about the
to.
you're talking about the study where the infants they did a study like early 20th century or early
Yeah,
1900s where
that's
they
right.
they were given no physical touch and they all yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean they
I just
didn't do that. They didn't construct that as a study on purpose, but
I was okay.
it was a tragic situation where tons of infants
I'm,
were
I'm glad
homeless.
I'm glad it was accidental. I was taught it was a study. I was like, Jesus Christ, what kind of shit were they doing in the early 1900s?
Yeah, that would have been uh, just horrible,
Horrifying,
horrible.
ghoulish. Yeah. Anyway,
So they were able to, in retrospect, look at that horrible situation and
yeah,
get a better understanding of how important not only human touch is, but this experience of co-regulation. Which, side note, anyone who wants to look into the science of it, Dr. Alan Shore pioneered attachment theory beyond a behavioral theory into what's called attachment as a regulation theory. That is,
yeah.
all these behaviors, what's going on in the nervous system underneath? How does
And that,
early development impact that, and so on?
and to really ground this into people's just daily lives, can you give us a couple of like, here's how to help your, relationship, or here's what to be aware of your relationship,
Oh,
or
totally.
because you and I could geek out on theory all day long,
Great
probably.
point. Yeah. So,
Um,
um, a great example is what is, I would say, playfully known as the anxious avoidant dance. There tends to be someone who is more on the anxious attachment side, and one who tends to be more on the avoidant attachment side of the spectrum. And if I was to just quickly outline the different attachment styles, the lowest level of stress is uh, regulated well. It's the secure attachment style. Attachment needs were insufficiently met. They end up in the yellow zone often, and it's referred to as anxious or anxious ambivalent, or sometimes preoccupied.
okay,
And they tend to be the type in the relationship that's more needy. They tend to have an automatic negative thinking, like, oh, you didn't do this thing that you normally do because you don't love me, and that type of thing, right? Or if somebody doesn't text you back, you make up the worst possible reason why.
sure.
It's the anxious attachment pattern from early development with your parental caregivers, which, by the way, parents don't intentionally do this. It happens because they don't know
Of
what to do.
course not. Yeah, parents are doing the best they can with the resources they have available, and we
Totally.
could always be, all of us could always be more resourceful with everything. So yeah,
Totally.
not to, yeah,
Yeah. And so the anxious person basically has a hyperactive attachment system, constantly scanning the room, the environment, for cues that, oh no, I'm not going to meet my attachment needs. Just like when I was an infant, and this is nonverbal, they don't know
sure.
they're doing this. And then the red zone is where avoidant attachment happens, and that typically happens from some version of neglect early on. So, for example,
Mm,
letting babies cry it out to
yeah.
sleep train them, they're actually going into overwhelm and exhaustion.
Right. The Spock,
Oh,
the
yeah, Dr.
which
Spock method.
by the way, Dr. Spock, not 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 a joke. When I was like, that was really his name, Spock, it really was.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah,
Spock.
just
Um,
just horrible.
and most parents that have done it, it's not about blaming the parents. It's like, okay, well, now we understand what happened, and you can always go into repair. No matter what age the child is, they can experience repair anyway. So that's another conversation. But the experience of the avoidant person as an adult, they tend to get
Sure.
overwhelmed because they didn't develop those social emotional circuits in the same way that people in the lower levels of stress experience.
Right.
And so they're actually tuned out in terms of recognizing their needs and feelings. And of course, they can't recognize it within themselves. How could they recognize it in someone else? And so they're usually like, I need some space. And if somebody brings up something that's too emotionally intense, they don't know why, but they're just like, I don't want to talk about it. Or, oh, just be positive. Why are you being so negative? And so they dismiss and avoid that experience. It's not
Sure.
a conscious, malicious thing. They're just overwhelmed because they never developed the circuits. And so, as adults in relationships, the avoidant person and the anxious person, they tend to have this dance where one person's reaching and the other person's like, I need space. And so, that's the typical experience in a relationship. There's always someone on the spectrum, somewhere more on the avoidant side, someone more on the anxious side. And you can switch depending on the person you're interacting with, how the person's acting, and so on. So we could go on and on with examples, but that's the
Sure.
gist.
Sure.
Oh,
And
I
me,
almost forgot, if I may, the four types of regulation, the ineffective versions of regulation, what's called external regulation in the yellow zone of the anxious person. They try and regulate through the other person. And by the way, regulation is an unconscious autonomic process. We can look at the surface of the behavior, but really it's something going on inside that we need to address on a deeper level at the body level. And so that anxious person essentially needs the other person in order to regulate themselves. It's uh, sort of a sucking energy type of thing that they unconsciously do, whereas the avoidant person will auto regulate. That is, they'll shut everything out, maybe play video games, or they'll smoke a cigarette, or they'll over exercise, or there are healthy and non-healthy versions of auto regulation, meaning you can't handle that level of feeling, and so you
sure.
shut down and you figure out a way to get your own space. And so auto regulation is not the same thing as self-regulation. Self-regulation, you're actually resourcing yourself and lowering your stress load versus tuning out.
It's
And
an
then the
important,
external, yeah,
it's an important distinction.
for sure. And so a lot of people will get into in this space talking about attachment and co-regulation and self-regulation, like, oh, it's more important to self-regulate first, or no, you can't self-regulate unless you have co-regulation. And often what they're really saying, the anxious person is like, co-regulation is where it's at, but they're not actually doing it in a healthy way. They're externally regulating and they're calling it co-regulation. And so learning and noticing what that is a really important thing.
Cool. So stages of dependency, I'd like to talk about stages of dependency and then circle back to the different types of regulation.
Mhm.
And by the way, one of my, I'll say blind spots, historically has been I presuppose adults. And I've had a few people be like, yeah, but with children, I'm like, yeah, yes, 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 totally. I completely get it. And I'm not a child development expert and I don't work with anybody under the age of 30. So I'm assuming, like, of course, parental imprinting and childhood development is important and critical to inform us about what's happening, of course. And that's always phase one whenever I work with clients, is working on clearing out all that stuff and dealing with trauma and dealing with parental, like even with business clients, the first phase is like, let's clear out those emotional gestalts and parental stuff and all that. Which I think is one of those things that even in my how to build like I don't offer this anymore, but I used to offer a how to build your coaching business thing and evolution, which was there has been different formats, but 4 months or whatever. Like there's been a few different versions of it, but we start with the emotional stuff and we include self-esteem and but stages of dependency is really you're dependent on parents, especially like you need your mother's milk to survive, period. Or you need caring and contact and, flesh on like all those things.
Mhm.
And then, and that lasts for, I mean, even once you can feed yourself, like say you're like I was cooking at the age of 8, you still are reliant on your parents for financial, like in shelter and all those things. And so that's dependency all the way through until the teenage years. And then you're counter dependent. Doesn't matter how amazing your parents are, you're like, well, I am not them, or I will do what they told me I should not do or whatever. And that's like the rebellious teenage years, right? And then there's independence, which I like to say is doing what your parents want you to do, even though they want you to do it. So it's like, hey, my parents want me to be a doctor, and you know what? I want to be a doctor. Even though my parents wanted me to do that, you know what? I actually desire to do that. And then there's interdependency, which is a chosen dependency. Like, hey, we're complementary. My wife has these skills. I don't. I have these skills. She doesn't. We make a great team. Or like, hey, or like, um, I'll cook, you clean you do the dishes, or vice versa, like whatever. Or when I was married, I loved to do laundry and I hated folding. She loved folding. I was like, awesome, perfect symbiotic, complementary, interdependent relationship, right? Awesome. Off to the side of that, once you get to not with dependency or counterdependency, but there can be codependence at any stage after that. And I define codependence as gaining your value as like your worth as a human being through how someone else views you.
Mm.
So that, what I didn't know about codependence, people who are adult codependents, I learned this 4 or 5 years ago, is that they also have a bunch of very subtle control mechanisms because they have a weird control aspect also. I didn't know that, and I'm not competent to speak on it, but I want to make sure we talked about those stages of dependency. So
Mm.
whenever I hear co-regulation, which you're going to expand on, part of my concerns are often, well, is it codependency? Is it like I need someone else to help me regulate, not in this moment, which could be as simple as my hand on her thigh calms her down, or just being like loving or compassionate in the moment with a stranger helps them feel loved, or like I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about like if they're fucked up, I'm gonna be fucked up too. I'm gonna have static in my nervous system is one way I would describe it. And so
Hmm.
those are things I've only ever seen. So when I talk about like we need to be autonomous first, and we could look at finances. Like the healthiest relationship is where you don't need each other, but you choose each other. You have an
Hmm.
interdependence.
Hmm.
So those are my, you know, I wanted to interject those critical thoughts on that, especially in romantic relationships where it can be so easy to slip into an unconscious codependence.
For sure. And I think, to state the obvious, there are many layers of this.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think there's a person who's alive who doesn't have some form of impaired integration. That is some form of little t trauma, if not big T trauma, in multiple layers of their experience that shows up as, that's catalyzed by the relationship. The relationship wakes it up. And so, how you choose to interact in those moments, well, it's an opportunity to either heal, either auto regulation or external regulation.
Sure.
External regulation being like a codependency, auto
Mhm.
regulation being independent, not interdependent, right? Where you're pushing someone away, right?
Well, I wouldn't call that independence. But I mean, so I don't think independence is pushing counterdependence would be pushing someone away.
Thank you. That's a better word. That's what I meant.
Okay.
So
Yeah, totally.
yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Um, and so there, there are two conversations going on. There's in a relationship, as far as I can sort of summarize it. On the one hand, we have like, okay, so where is my nervous system state generally?
Like a
And then,
baseline, like a
yeah,
like a
what's my baseline? What do
sure.
I bring to the table? How
Yeah.
independent am I, so that I
Yeah.
can enhance in the relationship rather than pull it down or
Yeah.
overcompensate and pull more than my share in a sense. I'm so oversimplifying it, but you get what I'm saying.
There we can only do oversimplifications, you know.
Okay.
Otherwise, this would have to be like we could do two separate weekends, part one and part two on these topics. Like we could, you know, like if we were, we're not, this is not a pre-sales thing, but like we could do 6 days or, five, like half a Friday and on these topics that we have laid out for this, this 45-minute thing. So they're all oversimplifications.
Well said.
Yeah.
And for the audience,
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure to clarify that
Yeah.
if you have questions or interjections about some of the things that I just said, good. That means you're looking at nuance. So on the one side, there's your baseline, right? And then there's what you're doing to work on yourself slash work on the relationship. And they're separate things, but in a relationship, you come together and you are in a position to be responsible for yourself if you so choose, and that would be a
Yeah.
healthy thing. And you're also in a position to be responsible for awareness of and support of your partner. It's not responsibility for them, it's responsibility that you choose to take on. I like the term response able. I'm more empowerment to the degree that I choose to take responsibility to make something better, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like, okay, my partner lags behind in these couple areas that they're struggling in, let's say regulating their emotions, taking being able to feel without collapsing, right?
Sure.
And I could step in and try and fix it, or I could go, okay, that's a weak spot for my partner, and so I can hold space for that and actively co-regulate. That is, be there with my body. And when I said co-regulate, sure, there's the conscious part, but the body level, the body language exchange that's going on, so much more is going on below conscious awareness than we know. So it's
Yeah.
about positioning yourself so that can happen
There's
with
also
your conscious mind.
there's also a sense in which like there's a sense in which we're always co-regulating. Unless because none of us are silos. Like if you're like if you're holding hands, or if you're, or just someone's a voice tone could have you, like if you're in any kind of relationship, you're always all the time co-regulating in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I just see the danger in people talking about like, oh, well, I'm getting healed through this, or I need to be in this kind of relationship so I can be healed. And I think that's very dangerous. I think it's very tricky. Relationships can be very healing, incredibly healing, especially if it's like you were judged or shamed for certain things in a previous relationship. And then you're in a relationship where you're loved, encouraged, and supported. And sorry about that. You're loved, encouraged, and supported. And that can be a very healing experience, especially if you'd been, not previously. But I've also seen in transformational communities this pattern of people looking to get into a relationship to be healed. And I think that's, first of all, it's not sustainable. Um, I don't think. I think it's, once the healing's done. Also, I think it leaves you open to people who are, um, as Mariah would call them, Captain Save-A-Ho, but, white knights or whatever.
Sure.
People who want to be saviors, and I'm like, no, I'm good I'm not doing that. No, thank you. So I think there's that aspect. I also think it's just it's important. We could talk about emotional enmeshment as well. Some of the best, which is like light codependence, I'll say. Some of the best periods of my marriage were when we were each seeing a master practitioner once a week to do a releasing emotional enmeshment. Like
Mm,
she would go in, get it cleaned out, and I would go, or vice versa, like whatever, sometimes but like doing a releasing emotional enmeshment, which is a process developed by Dr. Robert McDonald around just unconscious, um, and it's different. Some people are like, oh, it's like courting. No, the presupposition in courting is someone's reaching out to you and like hooking you psychically. That's not what this is. This is your unconscious mind has just developed organically, and it takes different forms. It might be like vines, or it might be, you know, like metal rods, or it might be like tar, or it might be like, beautiful, like there's different forms it takes depending on the stage of your relationship. And
mm,
sometimes it's just like webs or like sticky, the last one I had to clean out was like like a sticky, clear fluid, but it was, but it was still like, and I had to like dissolve it. Anyway, there's ways to do that. But I think it's important to clean yourselves out, and so that and we stopped second guessing like desires and choices and like all these things, because you stop going, is it okay with you if I want that thing, or if I say, that like that goes away. But you're still in relationship, you're still in rapport.
Mm.
And during the break you talked about the importance of relationship with the practitioner. Would you like to expand on that? Would you be willing to
Yeah,
expand?
absolutely. Well, this goes for relationships as well as client practitioner relationships, so intimate relationships as well as healing
Yeah, yeah,
with a therapist or coach, right? So there's this wonderful study done showing that of all of the different modalities out there, it wasn't the modality itself that made the difference. It was something called non-specific factors. Anyone venture a guess on what those non-specific factors represent?
uh safety, that's my guess.
Yeah, and what facilitated that safety was the uh, healthy co-regulation experience between client and practitioner. That's what facilitated the change. So
Yeah,
there are very helpful methods, and I'm not saying that all methods are equally helpful, but what I'm saying is what made the difference in all of these helpful methods was, as you would call it, I think, rapport. It's a bonded connection where um, you have implicit trust. You've developed, and when you have implicit trust, your body feels safety, neurological safety. You're relaxed, you're receptive, you're playful, even.
yeah,
There's an openness to express yourself and hear the other person, and you
sure,
automatically think about the best possible thing they could have meant by what they said.
sure,
Um,
yeah,
this is what happens in rapport, as you know. Um, we're able to get a lot further together because of that bonded, co-regulated experience. The nervous systems are in sync. If you actually were to observe their breathing and even monitor their vitals, they would
yeah,
be synchronized in a
yeah,
sense.
yeah, of course. This is one of the reasons I used to do a releasing emotional enmeshment process every single time after I saw a client in person.
Hmm.
It's also one of the reasons I schedule at least 30 minutes in between sessions. The other thing too that I think is important to note is there's a primary principle that I hold. Um, there's no such thing as a resistant client. There's only unresourceful practitioners, or uncreative practitioners. Or so I've seen too many people want to blame well, they're just resisting. Like, I'm sorry, but that's not their job to open themselves to you. Your job is
Mm-hmm.
to get into connection with enough so that they feel safe enough with you. That's on you as a practitioner. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
and it's incredibly indulgent to blame the client.
For sure, or to refer out if it surpasses competency, like because
What
we all have our range of competency, right?
100%. There's definitely been times where I've said to a client, and this is, like, I feel like you're outside of my range of, like, I don't have the skill to, I guess the responsible way to do it is I don't have the skill to, and by the way, not that I've also said that sometimes when I just didn't want to, like we all have a choice. Do I want to co-regulate with somebody?
Yeah.
Right? Like there are things you can be like, yeah, I'm good not connecting with that nervous system. Good.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's true in romantic relationships as well as professional relationships for us.
Yeah.
And
There's never a need.
that's a whole boundaries conversation too.
That's exactly where I was going.
Yeah.
You don't need to justify to anyone when it doesn't feel right. If it doesn't feel right, it's time to exit. That's okay.
No, I think there is some artistry to communicating that in a way that, I mean, they have a certain range of what they can receive.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're telling them, I don't want to connect to your nervous system, there might be a more narrow range of
Well,
what they're.
there's of course a way to say it, but it's one of
Hopefully,
those things.
hopefully.
Yeah, I'm more referring to intimate relationships. I've talked to a number of people who stay in a relationship they know isn't working because they don't know how to say why. Well, after a certain point, when you know that it's not working, you might not have the skill to explain why, but that doesn't mean you are obligated to stay.
I actually advise people not to say why. Especially in the well, when it's longer, you can just say it's just no longer working for me. But in the early stages, I think just saying, well, this just isn't a fit for me. And they go, well, why not? Because it's not a fit. Well, why not? Because it's not a fit. And they don't usually ask after 3 times. The problem with explaining to them why is they're gonna then view it as a objection to overcome. They're gonna try to prove you wrong, or
Mhm.
maybe, maybe inform you about how you're. And really, it just gives them an access point to try to leverage you, which
Mhm.
just gets icky. And so especially with women, I encourage them, when they're in the early stages of dating, just be like, this just isn't a fit, or it's just not a fit. And you know what? Sometimes people still have strong reactions to that, even though that's incredibly neutral. Um, Now, if it's somebody and you know that they're developed and they can hear feedback, but if you ask somebody why, you need to stress it's for feedback for future interactions, not to try to change their mind. Otherwise,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think it's just not a fit. And by the way, I also think that works professionally. Like it's just not a fit. It's just not or we're not in alignment. Could be something else, but it's just not a fit.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And then go away and do your own inventory around what would be a better fit for you in the future. I think that's a good self-discovery,
for sure.
endeavor.
Yep.
But yeah. All right. There's other things. We have so many things we could have talked about. I'd like us to wrap this up here though. Um, First of all, let's just talk about how you work with clients, and we'll of course include links and resources for them in the description and the comments. But so how do you work with people, Mr. Thomas?
So my company is called Holistic Fitness Lifestyle, and I offer a modality that has several modalities within it called Holistic Fitness Training. And on the surface, it looks like personal training, where what I do is I help you to tune into your body so that you can become aware of how to map out your nervous system and adjust your habits so that you can thrive to the best degree that you're capable. This improves your relationships. This improves really whatever area of life you would like. But uh, within the experience of holistic fitness training, there's another modality that I wanted to highlight called
Okay.
tension and trauma releasing exercises, for short, TRE. And essentially, what it is an access into the autonomic nervous system where you flip a switch essentially and get the body to go into what are called neurogenic tremors. It's this natural shaking state that happens. This is very gentle and meditative in nature, and it floods the system with oxytocin and calms the body. So essentially, it's creating a bridge, a connection between your gut brain and your head brain. And all of the parts of your body that have shut down in response to previous traumas or stresses that have not been released yet, uh, the body is now able to communicate with itself. And so the result is awareness increases, tension levels go down, stress levels lower, and you become more in tune. So that when we go back to, let's say, your fitness regimen, you start to become aware of things that you couldn't feel before. You start to notice when you're at capacity and you were pushing through before, and it wasn't actually very gentle with your body. You start to notice things about your breathing. You start to notice things about your own body language in relationships. You start to notice, oh my goodness, I completely ignored this cue from my partner, and I think I'd like to change that so we have better rapport, so we actually connect more deeply. So the method itself is really about personal growth through movement and accessing what's going on in the nervous system, shifting your habits. And I have a class on a platform called RelationFlix.com, among many other wonderful teachers. It's a subscription based platform with all of these different classes. There's one on nonviolent communication. There's one on tantra. There's one on
And we'll put the link
erotic
in the,
misogyny.
we'll put the link
Yeah,
in the description. Yeah. Cool.
and that course in there that I teach is called relational regulation, teaching you how to enhance your relationship skills through nervous system regulation techniques.
Good.
And then my other website has all of the fitness videos. Those are all free, by the way,
And we'll
and
we'll
different
link that
classes.
in the description as well. Cool.
Yeah, so that's the gist.
All right. And I've been doing this for a long time, so I'm just gonna say evolutionarycompanies.com. And you know, there's three basic ways I work with people, or three basic contexts. And you guys all know that. So I'll put that in the, but it's evolutionarycompanies.com. And I generally only work with people one-on-one for 6 or 7 months. And you know, there's two things I like to say. One is people are like, what do you do? I'm like, I help people get what they want. But the other thing is if you've done this thing and that 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 thing and you haven't gotten the thing, I'm probably the guy because I'll bring, you know, multiple modalities and we buckle up and we dive deep for a long, you know, for 6 or 7 months, depending on which package. So that's all I have to say about that. This has been fun. Thank you. And thank you
Absolutely,
for,
my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
and for those who are watching, I thank you for allowing us to be of service to you. And if you want to reach Mr. Thomas or myself, all that stuff will be in the description, and there will be a couple of images, which he mentioned in the comments, at least on social media. I don't think we can put comments on YouTube, but at least on Facebook. Thank you again.